Okay, let's call this meeting of the Hinley Homes and Royal Building Committee to order at 6:03 on December 13th, 2023. First order of business is to approve the meeting minutes from the December 6th meeting. Can I get a motion to approve those minutes? Sarah moves, Jameson seconds. All in favor? Aye. That's unanimous. Great. Any members of the public? I don't see any. I see Molly Hirsch from the press, but otherwise no members of the public here to comment. In terms of the chair's I'm sorry, go ahead. Was somebody going to say something? No? Okay. In terms of the chair's report, a couple things. We are joined this evening by John Zagrodsky, our newly elevated first selectman. Looks like Monica McNally, member of the Board of Selectmen and former first selectman. John Cini from the Board of Education. Jim Palin, chair of the Board of Finance, may join us as well. So everybody, welcome to our meeting. I just thought it would be helpful to maybe set the table before we dove into the substance of the meeting. Last week, we went through the GMP and total project cost summary that O&G had put together, and began a discussion on what comprised the increase of total project costs over our initial budget estimates. And we finished that meeting with a request to get a lot more detail to better understand why the increase was what it was. And I think over the past week, a lot of people on this call have been working pretty hard to get that level of detail, and we're prepared today to go through that in much more detail, and understand and discuss why the increase is what it is, discuss those factors. Prior to today's meeting, there were a couple of documents sent around, so hopefully the group has had a chance to look at those, but that's going to be the basis of that discussion. Since last week's meeting, there have been a number of building committee members and also some others from various places in town government that have raised concern about the magnitude of the increase, and have asked us to think about, gee, are there other ways to proceed with this project? Are we getting what is best for the town for what we're paying, or are there potential alternative paths that we could be following? KG&D, at our request, starting early this week, has sketched out on a very preliminary, and I would emphasize very preliminary, although I would also emphasize very, very thoughtful basis, a few alternatives, and is in a position to discuss some of those alternatives, and has, again, done on a very, very preliminary basis, tried to attach some cost estimates to some of those alternatives. And those, again, were in the materials that were sent around in advance of this meeting. But ultimately, the building committee needs to decide whether we want to recommend moving ahead with the project as currently designed, which was designed in order to meet and satisfy the adopted ed specs, and that has been priced out, and to request an increased appropriation to cover the increased total project cost, or whether we do not recommend moving ahead based on what total project costs are against the project design. It's not up to us to propose other courses of action. We can discuss them. Like I said, it's very, very preliminary at this point. That's beyond our mandate. If either we decide not to recommend moving ahead, or alternatively, we do recommend moving ahead, but the town bodies, Board of Finance, Board of Selectmen, RTM, decline to approve the increase, then it's really up to those town bodies, either on their own initiative or to direct us to work with the design team to consider other alternatives. But so we have kind of a, and I've described it to some other folks, some of the folks on this call, as kind of a binary decision point this evening, which is, do we recommend moving forward? In which case, we would go to Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance next Monday and Tuesday. And assuming they approve, we would go to the various RTM subcommittees and then the full RTM in January. Or do we not recommend going ahead? So that's my attempt to sort of set the table. And then I was going to turn it over to a combination of the ONGAP team and KG&D to walk through the detail on why the increase in total project cost, and then Eric to describe at kind of a high level some of the alternatives he's been thinking about. But before I do that, obviously, Jill, is there anything that you want to add from an introductory standpoint before we start on the substance?
Thank you for asking, but I think you captured it beautifully. Thank you, Chris.
Okay. So with that, Laurel, you don't have video, so I don't know if that means you can't screen share. Maybe
I might be able to screen share. I just need permission.
Okay, because Laurel, the slide deck that was sent around earlier today was prepared by ONGAP with a tremendous amount of work and input by Dave Martin and the KG&D team.
Laurel, I'm going to make you the host, and when you're done, please hand that back over. Thank you.
Okay, so I always have trouble with this. Let's try it. And let me see if I can get into presentation mode.
Boom.
Did it go into didn't go in presentation mode? Hold on. And okay, can everybody see this fine now?
Yep.
Laurel,
Yep, all clear.
Okay, very good. All right, so this was sent around, and it's really just a presentation of what will be made for next week. So the first slide is for presentation to the Board of Selectmen. Next slide would be for the Board of Finance. And then it starts with an overview, which I don't know if is my little ribbon in your way? Can you guys see it okay?
No, we're okay. We can,
so there's an
people can minimize the thumbnails. So.
Okay. So there's an overview. That's the first slide. That's basically the snapshot financially of what it is that we need in a pretty simple format. So it starts with the first row, total construction cost, and these were the numbers that we shared last week between Henley, Holmes, and Royal, as well as the total. We have the total of soft costs, which might have changed slightly because there was something else that was put in with the hazardous materials oversight costs. So that's just that went up a little bit. So that's reflected in the Henley, Holmes, Royal total. And then the owner's contingency, we had discussed last week about making it be 5% as opposed to 4.5%. So that is reflected. The 5% is on the subtotal going across. And then the total project cost. So it's the total construction cost plus soft cost plus owner's contingency. So now you have at the bottom between Henley, Holmes, and Royal going across, you have the total of 101, 490, 735. And then the current total appropriate amount is 82,500,000. doing the math leaves the additional appropriation needed, 18,990,735. So this is basically a snapshot of the construction cost plus the owner's soft cost plus contingency.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. Could somebody let Jim Palin into the call, please? He's in the waiting room.
I just did.
Thanks.
So does anybody have any questions on this? But this is just the purpose of this slide is so that everybody kind of knows what the ask is.
Yeah, and just projecting forward, assuming we get there, we're going to need to allocate that 18,990,735 on a school by school basis, which I think is just math based on what the appropriations were for each of the schools up to this point.
So any questions before I move on to the next slide? Hearing none. Page down. Okay, so the next slide, now we're going to try to put the 18 million into buckets. The 18,990,000 we're going to try to put into buckets to try to explain why we need the additional appropriation. So the first bucket and the biggest bucket is really the scope, what we'll call scope refinements. And the bulleted items are not an all-inclusive list. They're just representing the larger dollar value items. So there's a whole category there. And what was also sent out with the PowerPoint or the PDF was a more detailed list of how this was categorized between the three schools, the actual costs of how we arrived at that 5,642,000 and change. So does anybody need any further explanation? Okay, because I know Eric had distributed a sheet that had a lot more explanation than what I just gave, but I know the building committee is well familiar with all these items.
And I think Eric's sheet also does a nice job of breaking down what drove each of those scope refinements, whether what they were attributed to, whether it was the town approval process, unforeseen conditions, educational needs, et cetera. So you can sort of Eric's attribution of each of those items is the first part of his memo as well.
Whoops. I'm sorry. I moved forward without meaning to. Are we good with this, or sounds like it?
Why don't you, before you move on, Laura, why don't you just take a minute to explain briefly what each of them are? We have some new people on the call who are catching up, and not in a ton of detail, but I think it's important to understand what's in this bucket beyond
I would invite either Eric or Travis to go through them, if that's okay with you guys.
Sure. Eric, Travis, do you mind?
No, that's fine. And obviously, the memo that we put together sort of outlines basically the same list. But the additional stormwater detention is on two campuses. It's on the Hindley campus and on the Holmes campus. And it was really related to town approvals, but also neighbor concern. We had meetings throughout this process where we had neighbors as part of this. Neighbors submitted letters, and actually we went out and met them out on site and saw some of the conditions that they were concerned about. And so there's significant additional stormwater management at both the Hindley campus and on the Holmes campus.
Eric, we also worked closely with town, correct? And town employees on.
Yes.
Can you talk about that quickly, please?
So we met out on site, and there was additional discussions related to at Hindley, where the water was coming from, where it was. There's an existing pipe that's in between a couple of the neighbors' properties to the south, or is it to the east? And that flows it eventually flows back into the storm system, but there's the pipes aren't large enough to accommodate the amount of water that's going through there. So there's a discussion of basically maintaining an additional amount of stormwater on campus, and so there's a subsurface detention basins on both those campuses, and in this case on Hindley. And then similar at Holmes, there was a lot of investigation with the town as to where the water was coming from and where it was going to. The town owned property, which is now, as we understand, school property, is a wooded area where currently pretty much most of the detention occurs. And that flows into a pond. That pond at times has flooded. And then there's also a neighboring street that's on the backside of where the playing field is, where water's been descending on those properties. And so we are capturing all that water before it exits the campus. We are rerouting it. We're detaining it for a period of time before it gets released. Not sure, Jill, if there was something else that you were leading me to.
No, thank you, Eric.
In terms of additional site improvements, also associated with a planning board approval, there's dumpsters on each campus, and we're planning to screen all those dumpsters based on a requirement there. The architectural review board we met with on several occasions, and there was landscape and hardscape requests from them, some of which we've adopted into this project, and some of those, again, created some increase in terms of overall cost to the project. Unsuitable soils, there was testing on site because before you do footings and foundations, and even with the stormwater retention, when you're testing the subsurface ground, we found that some of the soils that are out there aren't adequate for capacity of the building foundations and footings. And so some of that soil actually has to be carted off campus. And so that was an additional cost that was unforeseen when this appropriation was originally planned. All three campuses, additional security was reviewed. Obviously, there was a base level of security that was considered as part of this project, but as it went, there were additional discussions in terms of the perimeter of the buildings and the access and entrances to the buildings and how to make them as secure as we can, and also to basically align them with the Oxbridge project, which was completed a year ago. Basements in the addition. So when we're looking at where the mechanical system should go and where building storage should occur, one suggestion along the way was, because we're building these additions and there's sloping sites, etc., there's an opportunity at a fairly minimal cost to expand the scope of work to add small basements so that we could put some of the mechanical equipment down there, as well as have additional building storage, which all schools really needed. They're currently being underserved in terms of storage capacity.
I think it's important to note there that the storage, and Alan or Kevin, if I miss anything, please comment, but storage needs were, we were so underserved there that we actually had way too much stuff in the hallways. It was not only messy, but not appropriate. You need those hallways empty for students to pass through safely and correctly.
Yeah, that's a typical concern for fire marshals when they go through on an annual basis. They're looking at egress patterns and making sure that the hallways are clear, as well as the stairways are clear of debris.
There's just far too much literally stuff in the hallways that had to be addressed. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. New main entrance and corridor at Holmes. When we originally looked at the music suite and where the music suite was planned to go before everybody got truly involved with the project. It had been planned in a different location. Ultimately, it was determined the best place for it would be adjacent to the cafeteria and the current stage. So since there's a real important adjacency there, that gave us another opportunity to create a secure entrance vestibule and a connecting corridor that led between the music suite and the main entrance. And that corridor was beyond the secure zone. So that was very helpful to have as part of the overall. But what it did do is it created some additional new construction, which wasn't originally planned in the original appropriation. Additional ceiling replacement work had to do with mechanical systems. When KG&D, our engineers, as well as O&G looked at APC, looked at how the mechanical replacement was going to go from within each of the different classrooms and offices. It was determined that the ductwork and piping associated with this work was going to be too difficult to accomplish without taking down several additional ceilings throughout the buildings. And so as a constructability measure, I guess I'd say that this work was added and included. It's a positive addition in terms of those classrooms will get new ceilings, but it did obviously at the same time create some additional costs to the projects. And then finally, roof equipment screens had to also do with planning approvals. When we went to that process, there's several pieces of mechanical equipment that's on the roof. One of the town regulations is to screen that from view and visibility. And so that was taken care of as part of that process. If we looked at, since I'm talking right here, I might as well just finish this portion of the project, then we can skip ahead. In terms of the increases attributed to the different pots of gold, if you will, the town approvals that we spoke about on this list is approximately $1.6 million all in. The campus security additions, that it's attributed to about $1 million worth of increase. In terms of unforeseen building systems, such as those ceilings that we just talked about, as well as this unsuitable soils, which was a fairly major one, including the basements, that was $3.4 million worth of increase to the overall budget. And then there were some educational needs that increased the budget, and those aren't on this list, but that had to do with furniture and technology, which was about $500,000. But that, excluding that $500,000, that's what the 5.6 is attributed to, is those between the town approvals, campus security, and the unforeseen conditions.
Oops, sorry. I touch it and it goes, I don't know why it does that.
You're back on, Laurel. It's your
Okay.
presentation.
Yeah, I'm not sure why I jumped it. There we go. Got it back. Anybody have any questions before I move on to the next slide? Hearing none. All right, the next one is pretty easy to explain. It's the add alternates. These were items that were bid separately. Since we knew we were having a budget issue before we went out to bid, we had identified 6 different alternates. Well, there was more than that. I think there were 7. But 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6 were ultimately decided to be accepted by the building committee. So their total is $452,640. So that's the value of that. And those are hard bid numbers.
Laurel, so you were going to investigate the benches. What happened there?
I guess they were really expensive benches. I'm just trying to think back on my notes when I was doing the scope. They were expensive, and I don't know why there was this disparity, because I only talked to the low bidder, but they priced what was actually specified, and one of the low bidders missed them completely. He didn't even price them.
Thank you. So I think the plan was based on the pricing that it would be better to purchase them afterward if that's appropriate. But that the prices were so expensive, even though it was a feature we were interested in, it wasn't worth overpaying.
Correct.
Yeah.
All right. The next item is inflation and escalation. So this was calculated based at 4.8% per year, and it's really just a carryover of when we bid the project. We rebid it, and we've pushed off the construction basically 11 months. Instead of starting in the summer of 2023, we are now starting in the summer of 2024. So that is reflected in the actual bid results, and therefore the construction costs that we're reflecting now. And that value is $2,931,418.
Laurel, can you explain how you got to that number? What were your inputs for that?
And I'm going to ask Dave Kraft.
So how we got to that was reviewing one of the publications we use pretty often is the Turner Construction Building Index. It's a national index that looks at market conditions and does forecasting on a quarterly basis. So in reviewing that, we had to do a little bit of estimating for the incomplete periods, but that was essentially the benchmark. I think they were projecting 5% for this period, but we went just a little under that because a little bit of the feedback we had received from a couple of our trades was that it was not across the board during the rebid that they were inflating or calculating escalation. There were some people who were actually honoring their equipment pricing. So we did scale that back slightly. And just to reiterate what Laurel said, that the 4.8% per year, we essentially took 11/12 of that, and that calculates out to I think it's 4.46 is the actual percentage that was applied.
So you built that number top down then, so am I correct in saying that you built that number top down? You basically took a percentage of the increase and think you can attribute it to escalation based on Turner? Did you do a bottom up? It sounds like you also did a little bit of a bottom up analysis, but did you compare low bidder last time versus low bidder this time and run a number to see how it compares to the Turner estimate?
It wasn't that simple to be able to do that. A lot of our analysis came from the scope reviews and simply questioning the trades about what they did see in these bids when they rebid, when they went back out to manufacturers to see if they were willing to hold pricing or not hold pricing.
Any other questions on inflation or escalation? Okay, moving on to construction management increases. So you'll see that's $1,890,889. This is due to additional on-site staffing, as well as because the total construction cost is increasing. A lot of our, our contingency that we put as part of the total cost of the construction work, our performance and payment bonds, our insurance, our fee, those are percentages. So if the total construction cost increases, so do these percentages. And then the additional on-site staffing is really due to, it wasn't the construction duration, Dave. It was.
Well, there are some combinations there. Some things that played into that were one of the things we did do, though, there were a couple of reductions in that, mainly related to taking the 27-month duration that we started with at the time of our proposal and shorten that to a 26-month duration, and that constituted a savings of about $160,000. There was one of the staff members that we had projected because of the scope increase. We had a part-time. One of the two project engineers was part-time. We felt that due to the increase in scope that across 3 projects that we needed that second project engineer an additional 20 months to make them another full-time person. Additionally, now with the way that the project is set up, we have about 4.5 months of procurement that we're going to be doing if this does go forward and we're able to award contracts in February. The goal was to, since we have that time, to take those the time leading up to the middle of June and get as far as we can with the submittal and procurement process. That way, the summer of 24, we can hit the ground running and attack these projects. So there was staffing that was needed for that. And then we pushed all of the staffing one whole year, the 26 months for one whole year. So there is a rate increase in there as well.
And Dave, could you just explain for folks how the CM contingency works and what would trigger a draw on the CM contingency?
Sure. An example that comes to mind, essentially what the CM contingency it's for scope of work that is essentially detailed in KG&D's documents. However, it was not fully purchased through the bidding process, because in preparation for the bid, we took the construction documents from KG&D and we craft an entire bid package, which is in volume 1 of the specification. And from there, we dissect all of the different aspects of the work and we carefully assign them to each of the packages, the 22, 23 bid packages we have here. There are some times in that, though, where we miss something. If there's some wood blocking in a detail and we highlight that one facet of it is to go to this trade, another facet goes to another. There are times when we miss that. That's also for things like if the project falls behind and overtime is needed, that would be funded from the contingency. It's essentially work that is needed, but it's not necessarily increasing the scope of the work. If you want to add another room onto the building, that would not be funded from the CM contingency.
But Dave, if we don't use the contingency, it all gets returned to the town.
Correct. 100% of the unused contingency is returned to the town. Yes. Thanks, Tom.
And while the Oxbridge project is materially different than the project that we're doing here, I'll just note that Oxbridge only used about half of the construction manager contingency that was built into their project, and that was done at the same 3% rate that we're using.
Okay, any other questions on construction management increase slide?
Yep, on the staffing, the additional engineer, is that in part because of the complexity of the HVAC and similar to what you did at Oxbridge, or is this?
No, that was one of the others. That's the MEP coordinator position, Jill.
Okay.
That we had talked about moving that to a full-time position.
And yes, so that additional on-site staffing is the MEP coordinator moving from part-time to full-time.
Correct. Yeah.
Partly. Okay, so the additional engineer is who? Did I hear you say that? I thought.
So the engineers, the project engineers are the ones that are a lot of all the information for the projects goes through them. And when we started, based on with the proposal, we were basing it on I think it was a $60 million project. So we figured at that time that for that scope of work, one engineer full-time across the 3 projects and then a second engineer for say just the first 6 months was adequate. But we feel that with the scope of the project increasing, it's not enough staff to make sure that all the necessary work that has to happen throughout the project with document control and making sure that all the changes are documented. We felt that second engineer needed to be extended to a full-time position.
So you basically have added one person in the form of half of an MEP and half of an engineer. Is that correct?
No, so the MEP was, we always had an MEP in there for part-time.
Right.
We had them in there it was approximately 1,100 hours over the entire project. And our recommendation is that we bring a full-time resource to bear, which is approximately another 3,000 hours to really focus on managing the trade, and the fact that we have one trade doing a bulk of the work. And it's the same trade that we had at the Oxbridge project.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then, but the engineer is going from you had 1.5 engineers and you're now going to 2.
Correct. Yep.
And
Two
okay. And is that all that's in that on-site staffing or?
Yes. Well, I mean, there's obviously the entire staff. There's, so the staff is comprised of a project manager, an assistant project manager, 3 superintendents,
right,
2 engineers, and an MEP coordinator.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just asking about the incremental.
The increase, yeah, the incremental increase,
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay. Next item is owner soft cost increases. So I do want to emphasize increases. So these particular bullets were just the bigger cost dollars. There's security, it's a function of also the construction security upgrades. There's also an owner component of it since they're hiring the cameras and that sort of thing. There was a little bit of an incremental increase in technology. We discussed last week the FF&E budget, how that scope has increased, and then the owner's contingency was carried throughout our estimates as a lump sum amount, and we have since revised it to a 5% of the total project cost, which is consistent with how other projects typically fund owner's contingency. So that value of the owner soft increases is about $3,669,593. And Dave Martin, I don't know if I missed anything else with that.
No, those are the largest ones. I think, perhaps with the addition of the last minute addition for the environmental and safety testing stuff, that actually was a bit of a surprise, but it's not the biggest dollar amount.
I think it would be helpful. I think it'd be, helpful to get a little bit more color on the owner's contingency, and just so that folks who aren't as familiar with the business and the market can get some comfort that is, in your opinion, a market number. Dave, I don't know if you did a compare and contrast with Oxridge and how much of their owner's contingency they ended up using. Did they use 5% as well? And why? Again, I don't want to overemphasize comparisons with Oxridge because I think we're learning more and more as we go along that it's a vastly different project than this is. So that may not be a really, really valid comparison, but it's kind of the most recent benchmark we have.
Well, I'll start out here. Laurel alluded to the fact that we started with a lump sum in the owner's contingency amount. When the initial estimate was originally put together, Kevin's predecessor volunteered that the town would take care of the owner's costs, and that included the owner's contingency. And so he provided estimates for what all of those items were. And in the owner's contingency line item, he filled in a fixed dollar amount. KG&D and ONG have consistently wanted it to be a % of the total project costs. And when we looked at it, we decided to make the move to making it as a percentage of the total project costs. At the Oxridge project, they did use 4.5% as the owner's contingency amount. And the report that I have is a little bit stale dated, but as of the time that the report was run, they were projecting that they were only going to use 40% of the dollar amount that they had for the owner's contingency. Obviously, a new build should have fewer surprises than the project that we are undertaking. So I can't promise you that we would only use 40%. In fact, I would expect we would use more, but I can't tell you exactly how much more of it we would use. And then as far as the 5%, Dave or Laurel, do you guys want to talk about that and how that's more of a market normal?
Sure. To your point, generally we see some new construction projects that are a little lower where, if there are budget constraints, they do cheat them down a little bit closer to 4%. But when we're dealing with existing buildings, we recommend that you never go below 5%. If you can afford to go over, but given where we are budget wise and what we know about the building, I'd say it's prudent to stay at 5%.
And if I could also chime in, also, these are not pure renovation projects. It's not like you're getting all brand new systems. You're getting brand new AC, but we are reusing a lot of the existing wiring and existing systems throughout the building. So it's also more of a chance of running into unforeseen conditions because we are not wholeheartedly replacing all of the systems in the schools.
So, Eric Hire, we would support that. We typically have 5% on all construction projects at this point in the stage, and that over the course of the project, if it's new construction, almost never use that 5%. It's probably closer to a 1 to 2.5% that's used for a project that's a new construction project. But with renovations and a lot of potential unforeseen conditions like what Laurel just mentioned, we feel it's prudent to carry the full 5% and hope that we don't find as much as we might find, and that we can return that back to the taxpayers or use it a different way.
It's industry standard 5% on any renovation or addition stuff. This is the right number.
Great. Thank you, everybody. You want to go to the next slide, Laurel?
Yep. And the last slide, the last slide that we have is really what was left over from what we started with the 18 million, whittling away at those other categories. We are left with market conditions. So I'm going to invite Tom Walsh to get us started with that slide.
Sure. Thanks, Laurel. So the contributing factors, there are, when we bid the job the first time around in July, it was a bad time, but there was a lot of other bids in the state bidding, especially work up north, central and Hartford area of the state, which a lot of the manpower that comes to work in Fairfield County comes from the middle part of the state. The contractors prefer to work closer to home and not fight the traffic load down here if they have other opportunities. And that hit AP not only on this project, but projects in Stanford that were bidding, especially the public work projects, which the contractors have to be DAS certified and pay prevailing wages as opposed to the private work. So because of the workload other places, there's a general shortage of labor in the marketplace now. Construction business is busy right now, and just getting the manpower to do the jobs is difficult. And so we ran into a situation here where it's kind of a combination of storms, but because of the other projects up north and the shortage of labor, our experience has been that the subcontractors really took advantage in terms of working closer to home, and then we suffered the price issues for that. We made a significant outreach, especially on the second time around, to try to force subcontractors to bid and get their commitments to bid. And we did that and had a fairly strong commitment to bid by a lot of subcontractors. And even up to the days right before the bid, despite their commitments, I would say it was about half of the people who had committed to bid actually bid to us. So we were able to get additional HVAC, additional electrical bids. And I think we saw an improvement in the pricing, especially in HVAC. because of the rebidding. But we didn't get, we got better coverage than we did the first time around, but not what I would say the type of coverage we were hoping for. And and I was, we were bidding the Stanford Museum and Nature Center virtually the same times, and that ended up having to rebid that project also. And the first bid came in 27% over budget. And while on the HHR schools, when we rebid the project, the numbers actually did come down. At the Stanford Museum, the project numbers actually went up again, another 3.5%. So the market, we really hit a bad time in the market.
And what was our final savings? It was 1.66. Is that correct?
I think it was just over 2%, 2.1%, I think was the total.
And Jill, that kind of absorbs some of the escalation number too, right? So that's a pure number to number.
Right.
When we looked at what the number should have been escalated by the $2.9 million. So I think the rebidding effort actually helped in terms of the actual numbers, but obviously the loss of a year and timing impacted it because the wage rates just increased over the time frame.
Mm-hmm. We rebid for a couple of reasons. We rebid hopefully to bring the price down, but also because the timeline was already so compressed that it was creating a lot of complexity for the project, correct? And so we've saved some money, but also, and then put the project on a more appropriate schedule.
Coverage was the most important rebid.
I think that's right. I think it was making sure we had sufficient number of trades looking at the project and bidding.
Yep. Mm-hmm. So if you want, if it's appropriate now, I can just, the last bullet there about looking at comparable school projects. So we had another project that was bid just about 3.5 weeks ago now. It was in Ellington, Connecticut, but it was a renovation and addition project, and we took it from a standpoint of saying, all right, let's look at our results, where we had our greatest variances, what the bidder participation was on our schools, and then look at that similar project, what their bidder participation was and what their variance was. And we did find that their packages that had more coverage had a reduced variance from their budget. And to get to that number, just at trade cost, I mean, it's about, I applied those, what the variances were, if we had gotten better results, and to Tom's point, we had a concerted outreach effort, and there were people that had committed to bidding the second time that just when push came to shove, they didn't. So, we were still under our expectation for some of the bids. When I applied those factors across our large variance packages, we felt that if we applied them to our project, that there's about $3.7 to $4 million at least of trade cost that's attributable to the fact that, while we did have increased bidder participation from the first bid, it wasn't, there were some packages that, we still had less, and that was some factor into the cost of the work.
Any other sort of thoughts, questions, comments on, I know this is a tougher category, right? Because this is kind of the everything else. It's a little bit hard to quantify on a line item by line item basis like you can with scope revisions, for example, or increases in FF&E. So this one's a little bit more amorphous. So I want to make sure that if people have questions about this category, this topic, that we air them.
Okay, so this was the last slide, other than there was a contingency slide, Jill, that I didn't know if you wanted me to go over or not, but we did create a contingency slide.
I think we've covered it. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so that this is it for the presentation and the explanation of the overage.
So, thanks, Laurel and the two Daves and Eric for that. That was helpful, very helpful. As I said, before we dove into this, there had been expressed, gee, is this the best way to proceed for the town, for the taxpayers, et cetera? Are there other things that the town might do as it relates to these three schools? And Eric, if you're willing, maybe so that those are put on the table, maybe you could go through a few of your alternatives and sort of how you costed those out. I guess I would say before we do that, just more generally, any thoughts or comments from the committee and others on the Zoom about just the overall package, the level of detail, the information that you've gotten to try to explain why the increase in total project costs is what it is. If not, then I guess I would turn it over to Eric.
Chris, before Eric jumps in, Alan, I know
Sure.
you have a hard stop at 7. Do you want to comment briefly, Alan, before you step out? You're on mute.
Thank you. I will hang on for a wee while longer, but I'd nearly like to see some of these. Why don't I hang in until Eric just goes over the options first, because that might just provide a wee better contact for me to make comments. I mean, I hope we can. I would like to continue with the projects that we have. I'm excited. We're excited about the project. I know we're talking about finances of them. Certainly they are. We've talked about Oxbridge, and certainly they're not a replica of Oxbridge by any means, but they never were. But the quality of the education, they're going to serve the quality of education. They're going to serve equality across the schools and the types of programs and instructional programs that everyone's offering. They are maintaining their neighborhood orientation, which I think is going to be a big thing. If we had to change or discuss any changes of that nature, that would, and many of you would know more than I in the history in the town. I feel the way it's been designed, that the work of the committee, the educational specifications, what we're seeing educationally in the buildings, I recognize the additional cost. If I set that aside for a second, I would be really advocating for us to continue to move forward in this direction. I think KG&D have been responsive to the board's educational specifications and what we're going to get to bring what the respective school communities are going to receive. I'm really excited about it. Clearly, just the idea of pivoting a little bit is I'm certainly keeping it in mind, but I kind of like what we've got at the moment and where we're going.
So before we turn it to, thank you, Alan. Before we turn it to Eric, Chris, I think you provided a little bit of context, but I think we might want to repeat it here. That the purpose of Eric and Travis and the team providing some options is not so that the building committee can decide to take another path. We're not charged with that. We're charged with meeting the educational specifications and deciding whether or not we want to move forward with this appropriation. What Eric's set of options gives us an opportunity to do is to see if we said no, what might it look like? What would be the complexities or the other opportunities? So it is truly, the committee does not need to make any decisions about anything Eric says. In fact, it's not, we don't have the authority to do that at this stage. Our charge is very clear to meet the ed specs.
Right.
Jill, do you want me to share my screen?
Yes, please. Or whatever you think, but
somebody has to give me permission. let me know if you can see my screen right now.
Yep.
Yeah. Terrific. So, as was just stated, we were asked to look at alternatives to the direction that we've been planning on going. And so the alternative ways to address district improvements at Hindley Homes and Royal, we looked at basically two primary options. One is proceeding forward as we are, which could be actually an increase in terms of renovation work. And the second was stop and look at a completely different option where instead of additions and renovations, we're proposing replacement on these campuses, similar to what was done at Tokenique 15 years ago and Ox Ridge more recently. If I look at, and so we called them option 1A and 1B, and then 2A and 2B. And if I can just briefly kind of go through this, please stop me if you have questions. So option 1A is the plan that we've been going through, which we have an 82.5 million appropriation, and the discussion just up till now was to increase that by $19 million because of the different escalations. This plan does meet the education specifications. It would be an excellent plan in terms of addressing all the needs of all three buildings. It brings the educational plan up to the same level as and is based on Ox Ridge. And it provides exceptional space throughout the building. Now, that doesn't mean that it's renovating every single space to be like a new building. So what we did here, and we were asked to look at, is what percentage of each of these buildings would be considered new construction versus complete renovation of a space versus where we're looking at really just the system upgrades. When we say system upgrades, it's really the mechanical systems that are going into the building. And so the ductwork and piping, which is throughout this building, and it also in some cases affects ceilings and lighting in some of the rooms. And so we are actually having to address some of that as part of this base project. And if you look at this between Hindley Homes and Royal, in terms of new construction, it's anywhere from about 20 to 29% new construction. You're comparing that to Ox Ridge. Ox Ridge obviously is 100% new construction. When we're looking at the heavily renovated areas throughout the building, it's close to it's 42 to 54%. So it's about half the building in each of these cases is being fully renovated. So if you add the two, the renovated and new construction, you're looking at about 70% of the building as being fully renovated, additions and looking like it's new. And that leaves approximately 26 to 31% of the building where we're just really looking at some ceilings and lighting and not addressing all the other finishes and millwork, et cetera, or furniture in those spaces. If you look at the next pair of lines, existing area versus proposed area. So that's the existing footprint today. And you can see across the board, it's approximately 57,000 square feet for each of the buildings. It's fairly consistent. And when we're done with this project, it's anywhere from 67 to 71,000. So it's about 10 to almost 15,000 in Homes case additional square feet. But again, that's substantially lower than the Ox Ridge building. The Ox Ridge building, as we know, has a slightly larger population and also includes the ELP program.
Eric, Eric, that existing area, that is the total square footage of each school right now, 56.8, 56.8, and 57.1?
That's correct.
Okay. That's helpful for the other thought about what percentage we are renovating or altering. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and for frame of reference, Ox Ridge is around 95, right, Eric?
Somebody told me that number recently. It has to be checked, to be quite honest.
think-
I
Okay.
don't.
All right.
Oxbridge gross is like 109.
All right.
Okay.
So see,
Yep.
thank you, Dave. I wish I'd had that number before, and then we would have been correct here, but appreciate it. So that makes for the total for, again, the plan that has been in place that we've been working on for the past year and a half almost at this point as $101.5 million. An alternate to that, and this option was really related to, well, you're still talking about several spaces in this building, classrooms, toilet rooms that aren't being fully renovated. And you're not going to be looking at this apples to apples if we want to potentially replace. So all three schools and what the cost of replacement all three schools was. So in this option one, in A2, we looked at basically that 101.5, and then on top of that, taking the additional areas that weren't being fully renovated. And now if we fully renovate those areas, what are we looking at as an additional upcharge? Understanding that we are going to be designing those, going through the planning process, bidding and awarding those, not in 2023 dollars, but in probably 2024, $25. And so in this case, you can see that we've eliminated the one column here. And so everything else that wasn't new construction, the new construction lines are still between 19.5 and 29%. That hasn't changed. But in this case, everything else is being renovated completely. The building size doesn't change, but the cost. And so we did a little bit of a calculation. We basically mapped out the entire building, the areas that weren't planned to be renovated. We calculated what that net square footage was. And in Hindley's case, it was 17,700 square feet. In Holmes's case, it was about 22,000 square feet. And in Royal's case, it was just under 20,000 at 19,800 square feet. We multiplied that by $600 a square feet. That's a total project budget. That's not construction. It's everything included. It includes contingency and escalation in there. We think that's a fairly conservative number. But at this point, until we really sort of have an opportunity to look a little bit more closely and really understand and analyze how we'd want to renovate those spaces, those were the factors that we used as the base model. From that, Hindley was an additional 10.5 million, Holmes was additional 13, and Royal was an additional 12. And then we also have our furniture budget, our FF&E today, as part of the base, is putting new furniture in all the new construction spaces only. So if we were to fit out the rest of the building with new furniture, so that every single classroom had new furniture to align with the new construction, the budget today is an extra $1 million. And so that option A2, a total price of 138 million. So it's another 36 million or so above what the base model was. Does that make sense? Any questions?
Eric, I have a quick question. It's Monica. So your 600 is inflation adjusted?
Yes, it is.
Thanks.
And again, we'd really want to, if we wanted to go this direction, I think we'd want to spend some time, look at the different spaces, what we're doing to them, and then what we want to do to them. Because if it's replacing the floor, painting the walls, and replacing some additional ceiling and millwork, that 600,000 may be high, and we may be able to adjust that down. If it's, you know what, we also want to include windows and doors and hardware in there, that number may be slightly low. So we'll really need to.
Sorry, what was your construction? What was your square footage number for construction? 450, 500?
Yeah, 450.
Okay.
And then the rest is soft
that tracks.
escalation.
Yeah.
That tracks. Yeah.
Eric, this is Tom Walsh. The other issue here is how the state views this type of a process. Right?
Well, in terms of state aid, that's going to be something that we're going to have to do a little bit more research in, because if this whole portion of the project was included as part of the original, I think we would be able to get state aid on all of it. Now that we have a project that's up there that has been approved, if we go back with additional work on the same campus, they may look at this differently than if it was all inclusive to begin with. So that's something that we're just going to really need to sit down with the
So
state to see.
there's a risk that there would be less state contribution for this incremental additional renovation. We'd have to take that into account for sure.
That's right. But the thought here with option A2, and you can probably do it different ways, but the model here was you award the base project. You start the construction in summer of 24. And at the same time, you're doing the analysis, the design work, the planning work with the state, and then you're going to the state later next year or middle of next year, getting the approvals so that the following summer or the summer after that, you can actually accomplish this work at the tail end of the base project. And since most of it's interior renovations, you may be able to roll that in. I'm not saying that you can't right now, but it really depends on how quick the process can move through the design and state. Page 2 has to do with option B1 and B2. And the difference between the two here is B1 is planning on our existing campuses, on our existing playing fields, constructing new 70,000 square foot buildings to align with the number, the additions and renovations number that you saw in the A1 the option 1A1 projects. And in this case, you're constructing new, similar to what you did at Tokenique 15 years ago, similar to what you just finished at Ox Ridge. When that new construction is complete, then you tear down the existing building, you put the playing fields, playgrounds, and parking lots where the existing building is. So you're basically swapping where the footprint is now and in the future. So in Hindley, when you're on Post Road and you're seeing the building is adjacent to Nearwater Lane, in the future, it would be closer to the church next door. It would be on the left side. At Royal, when you're on Royal Street, I believe it's called, the playing field, which is right up against the main road, it would be on that playing field. When that building is done, you would tear down the existing row. And similar at Homes, you'd be most likely putting the building on the playground in the back of the property. And then when you're complete, you're tearing down the existing building. You're putting all the parking, playing field, and playgrounds more in the front of the building. So looking at this, you can see in this grid that on all three campuses, you have 100% new construction aligning with what you have at Ox Ridge. The existing buildings of 57,000 square feet get increased to 70,000 square feet. And then our thought here was there's no way that you're going to want to do all three of these schools simultaneously, that you're going to do them in sequence. And so you do the first one starting in 2025, the second one 2 years later in 2027, and the third one 2 years after that in 2029. And so we looked at escalation. You heard the Turner Construction Cost Index. We used that same index, that between 2020, where it's 109,000 square foot Ox Ridge School was constructed for $65 million in 2020 dollars. That same school today, if we bid out in 2025, would be 35% more expensive. In 2027, 45% more expensive. In 2029, 55% more expensive, just based on escalation and what our expectations. And so you say, how are you figuring out, because the Turner Construction cost index doesn't look forward. It analyzes back. And so at the bottom of this sheet, we have escalation based on, we do have factors for 2021 at 8%, 2022 at 8%, and then we are scaling it back down because typically on a long-term average, it should be construction over the course of the last 20 years has been about 4% increase per year. It's higher than regular inflation. Not sure how to analyze and describe why that is, but for the past 20 years, it's been about 4% per year. So we're taking what's been inflated escalation over the course of the last 3 years and scaling it back every year till we get, by the time we get to 2026, we're back at 4% and we're just projecting that out. So there is, we had a 10% increase for area here. And you may comment about that here because we just heard this evening that the existing building isn't the Oxbridge isn't 95,000 square feet. It is 110,000 square feet. So if it's 110,000 square feet, and our buildings that we're proposing here are also, I'm sorry, I have to go back here, my friends, because I need to go back to B1. So we're talking about 70,000 square foot buildings. We had a 20% reduction because we were reducing from 95,000 square feet to 70,000 square feet. Because it was going from 109,000 to 70,000, that reduction probably should be a little bit higher. So we're seeing numbers of 70 million, 75 million, and 80 million. I'm not going to off the top of my head, but just say it might be 5 million less per school. So instead of it being $225 million for 3 brand new schools, when we're all said and done, it might be 210 instead of 225.
Yeah, Eric, we're really talking directionally here, not real numbers.
Absolutely. And, we would definitely need to spend some more time here, but I think what we were asked to look at was, if you're looking at different options, what kind of ballpark are we potentially in terms of new construction versus renovation? These renovations, as Alan said at the beginning of this discussion, is we are doing a lot of wonderful things, renovating these buildings and putting these additions. We're meeting the ed specs. We spent a tremendous amount of time and effort getting these spaces the way that we want. And the school district's comfortable with that direction. But at the same time, if we are going to because we're $19 million higher than we're supposed to be, if we're going to reanalyze this, what is it possibly going to be if it's new construction? So here, somewhere in the range of $210 million to $225 million would be kind of a range right now.
But that's at $1,000 a square foot, Eric.
Well, it's also the demolition. It's all the site work associated with it. So
Right.
It's not just the building, but yes, it's
but
the site work.
I want everyone to understand, the demolition is not going to take us from $450 a square foot or even $600 square foot to $1,000 a square foot. Might take us to $650 or $700, but demolition is, this is kind of where I wanted to get to this, and we've not had a lot of time to review. We just got this, and this is a great snapshot, and this is kind of the numbers I was trying to get to about what really makes sense. Spending 101 on partial renovations, or spending what it will be for new schools. So that's kind of where I'm hung up. I know that's not the function of this committee to make that decision, but it does weigh on the factors in voting on something, knowing that there's another option out there. That's what I would say.
Okay. Anybody else? Option B2, actually, instead of doing 3 schools on the 3 campuses, you select 2 of those 3 campuses and you put 2 schools that are 50% larger. One of the challenges here, well, why are we doing that? Because potentially 2 schools, even if they're larger, there's some means of sort of cost reduction by having 2 schools as opposed to 3, both operational and construction. And so in this case, that 225 went down to 210. That 210 might also go down a little bit because of the square footage discrepancy between Oxridge.
Right.
But that being said, the real challenge of going from 3 schools to 2 schools is not just construction on a site that's a school site that's operational is always challenging. When you're trying to add 50% more space to a campus, which the state ed department would basically state is undersized based on their recommendations for size for a campus, that going 50% larger just makes that challenge that much greater. And so that would be something that the committee would have to think about pretty hard. Is you have 3 8-acre sites. You can't put these sites together and make a 16-acre site. So you have no additional land. You're going to have 50% more kids, which means that you're going to have 50% more classrooms. Your cafeterias are going to have to be 50% larger. Your gym space is going to have to be 50% larger. Your media learning commons are going to have to be 50%. The resources are large. Everything gets larger. You have 50% more parking on campus. And since we have finite space, that means that what ends up losing is probably playground and playing field space. And now you can say, well, our buildings today are generally 2 stories. Can we go to 3 stories? Yes, you can. Kindergarten, first graders have to be on the ground floor, but the other grades can be on upper levels. And so our footprint doesn't necessarily have to increase by 50%, but you still have functions that you're going to have on your main level, not just the kindergarten first graders, but you're going to have your cafeterias and your learning commons and your gymnasiums on the main level so that they're easily accessible, and some of your other special subjects. And so your building footprint's going to increase. And so that's where this option right here, in my personal opinion, gets very challenging. And with that, I'll open it up to the floor.
Yeah. Thank you, Eric. That, again, as Paul noted, very, very thoughtful and I think really, really helpful. But again, I think that's just in the nature of there are options out there, right? Ranging from somewhat more limited to pretty extremely different from what we have now. That the town and the Board of Education and school district facilities can consider if we decide not to proceed with the project as currently conceived, or our increased appropriation request is not approved. I think, look, I'll just editorialize for a second. If we were back in May of, and I've said this to a few of you already, if we were back in May of 2022 in our original estimates, when we were if folks recall, we were doing very much kind of back of the napkin, gee, how much is this going to cost? We have to put a number into the state by June 30th of 2022. I mean, if we had estimated at that point that this was going to be $100 million, my guess is we probably would still be doing this project. We wouldn't be here today worrying about the increase, or if the estimates before the bid were closer to the $100 million number. Same thing. I think this is largely a function of there are a number of factors that we discussed tonight that took us materially above what was originally estimated and budgeted. So I guess I'll ask the question, do people feel like they're satisfied with the explanations about the increase? And then secondly, the folks on the committee want to weigh in and give their views, or if any of the folks from town government want to weigh in and give their views on which direction we want to go here before we decide to put it up for a motion.
Yeah,
I
this,
have-
this,
go ahead.
this is, well, go ahead. Our committee members can speak, or I can speak whenever.
Well, this is Jill.
Sorry.
No, thank you. I just wanted to note that I think that one of the things that this process really highlights is the limits of the state process, where we need to determine a price before we really even have gone through a design process. And, you know, while it worked in the case of Oxbridge, it really has not worked for this committee. We started our appropriation as based on the initial kind of sketch from NCA, but that is not the design we ended up going with for a variety of important reasons, including better circulation and flow, better lighting in the classes, better use of the educational spaces. And I think as a committee, we were very committed to a high quality design for these schools, and I stand by that. I think that the other thing I think still holds true is that the quality of the schools is excellent. The facilities themselves are high quality. This is what we saw in our 2016 building condition survey, and then the maintenance on them has been excellent. So they are in good shape for an update. And I continue to believe that is true. And Kevin can back me on that, please, in a little bit. Lastly, I think that it's important to emphasize our ability to update and to bring these schools up to a standard we're happy to put forward. We are right sizing all of the classrooms to the standard of Oxbridge. We are updating mechanicals, the building envelope, a lot of the systems, and I think in particular for the user experience, having AC in all the classrooms is exciting. I think the only area where we really fundamentally change how we educate students is the library and how we use the library. And each of the libraries is being either renovated or completely rebuilt. And the last piece I think to consider is timeline. And while we don't want to make a poor decision in service of a timeline, I think that this timeline that we're on makes a lot of sense. And given that, you know, based on what I've seen personally, I think our assumptions going in hold true. It's just that the price has changed. I'll stop there.
John?
Yeah, hi, everybody. Just in looking at this, I recognize, well, first of all, I applaud all the work on this. It really is just very high quality, and all you folks that are volunteering to support this effort. As always, it's very much appreciated. And I'd also applaud just the maintenance that's being done now, but that has been done over the years. If it had not been so good, we would not be having this discussion, right? There would be no way we could do a renovation and get away with it. But it's a real testament to not just the maintenance staff, but the Board of Education's focus on that as a priority and something that we should keep in mind going forward. That said, and I recognize the comment earlier that, look, if we had estimated 100 million and it came in at 100 million, maybe we wouldn't be having this discussion, but we are. And I guess where I came out on this was when that number hit, it forced me to just take a step back and say, look, are we thinking about this holistically? But more importantly, for that kind of money, are we putting everything on the table in terms of options and where we could go with this and every creative thing we could think of before we go to the taxpayers and say, hey, we're going to have to come at you for another 20 million to make this plan work. And in that spirit, I think you guys have prepared what is really the full range of options, what we're proposing right now versus actually just replacing all three schools. And so that I think puts it all on the table. There's no doubt. If you think about this renovation, I mean, for $100 million, I'd heard conversations earlier that said, oh, yes, we do this and it'll preserve these schools for another 25 years, and that's great. That needs to be true, right? Because we cannot come back and say in 10 years, we need another $100 million or the inflation adjusted equivalent of that to do another redo of these schools to get them to the point that they could in fact last 25 years. The other thing I would say is that when we redid Tokenique, we still had renovation bonds or bonded money from a renovation that had not been paid off at the time that school was torn down. And so it could be in the future that if you look at these buildings and say, geez, we really have to tear them down and start over, it's going to be a really painful message to taxpayers to say we spent $100 million on renovations and now we got to tear these buildings down. And by the way, we haven't actually paid off the 20-year bonds for this $100 million renovation. That's going to be a very bitter pill to swallow. So my first message is, if we go down the path of a renovation, it is extremely important that you guys are eyes open about what that means for our taxpayers and for parents of our children, that you really are saying, look, we want to stick with these buildings for another generation, and when we feel like this renovation is going to get us there. It would be, as I said, really bad to go back and ask for a lot more renovation money or to take these schools down if those renovation bonds have not been paid off. And the second thing I would say is that it really was striking to walk into the Oxridge school when it was finished and then see these other schools. The delta between Oxridge as a new school and these schools fully renovated, even if they are renovated to the 1B standard, right? Replacing bathrooms and all that. There's still an awfully big delta between Oxridge's new build versus these fully renovated schools. And I just wonder, again, looking at that and looking at the pace of technical change, the pace of expectations around the classroom experience and kind of all of that, are we really keeping up with that in the right way with these renovations? Or is the ultimate solution really, again, just given the pace of change, really just a renovation or sorry, just a full replacement? And again, you look at these numbers, it just forces you to take a step back and consider that once more. The final point that I'd make is, or two last points, is that I felt like with Oxridge, and if I go back and look at the record, I suspect it was true with the high school and with Tokenique, it felt like there was a decision made long before we replaced Oxridge where we're not going to spend a ton of money on anything that we would waste if we took the building down. And we fixed some things, but we didn't make a lot of renovation type improvements to Oxridge, and basically took the approach of run to failure, right? And when the day came, we had gotten to that point and there was no qualms about taking that building down. If you believe that long term, or even in kind of the 10-year time horizon, that some of what I said before holds true, you may actually say, well, yeah, maybe the right approach is an option 0A or before option 1A that says maybe what we should be really doing is focusing on more of a run to failure model, get the most we can out of those buildings, and then a much shorter time frame replace those buildings. Keep in mind the approach we've had. I know it's different, but just philosophically, the way we've done fire trucks in town for a long time is there is a master schedule of all the CapEx we need to spend on those vehicles. And we know how long they are and just about how long we have to spend before they have to be replaced. And we just tick them off in order as we march forward through time. And I look at these schools, especially, which is my last point, you take into account our remaining schools, maybe having a sequence to that where we take out the first school and the others are kind of run to failure, and you have that kind of approach and just say, is that maybe a different way to look at this? It's important to note that Middlesex was last updated sometime in the late 1990s. That's starting to be 25 years ago. I know, Jill, you've mentioned the roof replacement that has to be done there. So there's CapEx that's going to need to be spent on that school. And hard to believe, but the high school that we just spent all that money on, that school is almost 20 years old. And Tokenique is not far behind. And so there's a lot on the horizon potentially for school building capital. And again, this $100 million number just gave me pause and it forced me to just sort of try to think holistically about this. And so in conclusion, the committee's really kind of got sort of two choices, maybe two and a half. The first option is to say, yes, we've thought about all that and we still believe and would represent to both our parents and taxpayers that option 1A is the right option. And we really want to march forward with that. Having thought about these other options, we still feel like it's the right answer. And that's what you would recommend to the Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance, and RTM. Or you say, look, based on this whole conversation, we feel like we do need to maybe reconsider this a bit and reflect a bit more just to make sure we're making the right decision. I recognize that's got costs entailed with it and might result in having to rebid And you may end up exactly where you are now with 1A, but at least that additional time would give you a chance to reflect and just confirm one last time that this course of action is in fact the right one. We're dealing with big numbers, and it's just very important to parents as well as taxpayers to make sure we get this right, measure twice and cut once. So those are my comments. As I said in my State of the Town, I'm fully committed to supporting schools. This is very important for everybody who lives in town, whether you've got kids or not. But it's such a big number, and it's a pretty complex process. My message to you is just make sure you've got it right in terms of what you want to recommend.
Thank you, John.
Hey, Chris, it's Jim Taylor. I'm not sure if I can just chime in here for 1 minute, just
sure,
between meetings right now. But listen, I've been listening to the whole conversation. I won't repeat everything that John said about the fact that we need to kind of think about this twice, think about it 3 times, really make sure we're making the right decision. But as you guys think about costs here, as John said, we need to be thinking about value. What are we actually getting for this? And then when you're thinking about costs, and we're talking about a $50, $100, $150 million, $200 million type investment in our schools, which represents 75% of our overall spending, we shouldn't be thinking absolutely about what it costs, because we would bond these over 20 or 30 years. And so, I would just leave people with I'll run some numbers tomorrow and kind of share it with the rest of the committee, but think about what the incremental cost is per year relative to the overall school budget. If you think about if your plan were to change and increase spending by an extra $50 million, obviously we'd be getting something different than we're currently planning. But the debt service related to that, just to frame this, is half of what the annual increase in the Board of Ed budget is. So I'll send around to you all tomorrow some numbers so you can begin to translate costs, value, and what that equates to in the context of the overall annual budget, so it can help you think about relative value a bit.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else?
Chris, I just have a question on timing. How does this work for state reimbursement and all of that? How quickly do you need to make decisions on this?
Well, I think the $82 million that's already been appropriated has been approved by the state, and that's available for reimbursement.
And Chris, I believe the statute is you have 2 years to put a shovel in the ground from the date of grant commitment.
Right. So we would really just be going back. We've already submitted some of the information necessary for the amended request. We just need the dollar amount and the evidence of approval. So it really would be this spring and whatever time we're ready to start seeking that reimbursement. So we're not really being driven by the state process for the additional appropriation.
Okay, thanks.
I think there's a few things. John Zubrowski, you mentioned rebidding. I believe Tom, Dave, you guys advised us on the wisdom of rebidding a third time, correct?
Yes.
Can you repeat that advice, please?
I would not do it.
Yeah. My point on that was not to encourage a third rebidding, really to just say, I recognize that we're up against a deadline in order to pursue 1A without having to rebid. I don't know exactly what that deadline is. I'm hoping it's not tonight in terms of you guys making a decision, but it's soon. And I was just saying that, look, if you really felt you needed more time to get this decision right, that given the size of the project and all the dynamics I mentioned before, I would err on the side of getting all that right, and that the bidding, yes, it's it's unfortunate if we went down that path. I hear your point, but still it's important to get all this exactly right.
And John, the things that you're wanting us to get right are the, if I could just repeat, you want it to last for 25 years. We know it's a limited renovation, which we can see from that second option. So we know that there is additional work that needs to be done. And the change between Oxbridge and those renovated.
Yeah,
I would disagree with you on that point, but again, I like an older building.
I'm old. I like everything old, and as I get older, it's increasingly alluring. But no, my point is that, look, if you think about setting aside maintenance costs, if you think about the CapEx costs of these buildings for the next 25 years, if what you're saying is, look, this will cost $100 million to do this renovation, and oh, by the way, we would reasonably need to do all those other renovations as well, bathrooms, whatever. I'm just saying to put that all in cost as well, because because what you're really ultimately doing is trying to compare what you want to do now and everything that you're going to be spending over the next 25 years, and then compare that with the new school route. And again, just because if you can compare those two numbers and say, well, this one is cheaper, we will get very close to Oxbridge, we're good, then that's okay. But I'm just saying it's difficult to say, well, we'll spend 100 million now, and you come back and say, I need another 50 or 75 million to get me through 25 years of those schools. We're starting to get close to the replacement cost of those buildings. That's all I'm saying.
If it's not us that makes the decision to change paths, if that's the case, who is?
Can I jump in here? I went back and I looked at the original charge for our committee, and I'll just read it out to you for one of the schools. It's the same for all the schools except the school name changes. Resolved that the Darien Board of Selectmen hereby creates a building committee to oversee the renovation and construction at Henley Elementary School, and that the building committee, known henceforth as the Henley Homes Royal School Building Committee, be authorized to renovate in accordance with the educational specs for Henley Elementary School, as approved by the Darien Board of Education. So my reading of the charge for the committee is we develop a plan to renovate the building and we put it forward at whatever the cost is. If there's a decision to be made on whether or not we go forward with, if we're going to do something different than a renovation, that gets kicked back to the Board of Education and the Facilities Committee from the Board of Ed, because the plan to renovate these buildings was done as part of the 2016 Board of Education master plan, and it was decided to replace Oxbridge and to renovate these three schools. So if we go with an alternative other than renovate, I think it has to get kicked back to the Board of Ed and the Facilities Committee thereof to make that decision.
Yeah, I think the one caveat I would add to what you said is, while our charge is to renovate to the ed specs, that doesn't mean to renovate to the ed specs at any cost, right? I mean, we're being charged with doing it in a responsible way. And so I think back to what I said at the beginning of the meeting, I think our decision, whether it's tonight or at another time, is to make a decision whether either A, to recommend moving forward at the price point that we're at, or not to recommend moving forward at the price point that we're at. And if it's the second of those, then I think Dave Martin, we're in the universe you were just describing, which is it goes back at the direction of the town government to the Board of Education. Jill, is that correct in your mind?
Yes.
But we have to, I think we're being looked to, and I think rightly so, we're being looked to make a recommendation either to proceed at this price point or not. And then again, we have that doesn't mean it's going to be approved, right? For all the reasons and some others, that John Zagrodzky laid out, it may not be. but we have to decide whether we're going to recommend it and tee it up.
Yeah, and maybe one way to think about this, and Palin was just sending me a notice with some clients, but he did a quick debt service calculation on $50 million in incremental debt, and it's something like 2.3 million out of a total town budget of 165 million. Not trivial, but it puts this in context. Maybe what this committee does is the Board of Ed is going to hear all this. Jill is going to communicate that to the board. To David's good point, this committee's charge is to come up with a recommendation based on the specs that you were provided, and a recommendation 1A checks that box. And so what you could say is, look, we've heard all this based on the specs that you gave us. 1A fits the bill. Here you go. And then it's really up to the Board of Education to take that and this conversation and say, okay, well, if we don't change the specs, this feels like the right recommendation. We'll ask the other boards to approve this. But if we want to reconsider this or take a second look, we can try to do it before the current bids expire, or maybe not. But to your point and Jill's confirmation, it really is the Board of Ed's job to decide whether specs need to change or another path is needed. It's really just this committee's charge to make a recommendation based on the original specs. So maybe that's the right thing to do.
Well, but in terms of the path, if this committee moves forward, John, it goes to your board, right? And
Right.
So you guys have the authority really then next.
Well, that's true, but we're going to call you.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you.
But seriously, just that sequencing aside, I really think the question is Jill, what do you want to do with this? And I know I see Sini's on the call as well. Maybe you guys go back to your board and say, does any of this resonate with us in terms of wanting to take that second look? I'm not trying to overly stir the pot here. I just want to make sure that for something like this, that this is just taken into account. You may completely decide, nope, this is what we want to do, and I can totally respect that. But the comments I had before were just to say, look, lots to think about here. This is not an easy call to make.
And Dave Cravenzola, just double check me here. If we take the path that John is suggesting to take a second look, the due date for us would be the end of January, right? The bids are only good to the end of January that we currently have, right? After that, all bets are off. We have to go back to each subcontractor and ask them if they would still stick with their bid.
Correct.
At least for the 7 that the other
ones that
bids, we have a
redid,
longer
yeah.
time frame, right?
Not
We
much
have
longer.
no
Not
like
much longer.
like a week and a half. I think we had been able to get it because we were accounting for that, with the RTM and then the 10-day waiting period. So we were coming in right at the cusp there. So it's right around February 8th, I think, February 10th.
February 8th,
Like
because our bids came in November 8th, and they're told them for 90 days.
So
I guess I want to. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dave Martin, and then
So technically, that decision would have to get made prior to the January RTM meeting, because that would be the final vote that would be required on behalf of the town. I'm sure that John and Jim would agree, as needed, the Board of Finance and Board of Selectmen could arrange special meetings to get it done. But the RTM is kind of a hard stop date.
Yeah,
So,
I want to just go ahead, Jill.
Sorry. Well, just to review that process. So, right, the sequence of events is if we decide to ask for an appropriation, we then go to the Board of Selectmen. Our plan that we had initially was it would go to the Board of Selectmen on Monday, go to the Board of Finance on Tuesday of this. So that's 18th and the 19th. That enables us to, if each of them is a gate. So if each of them says yes, we go to rules in early January, and then we're at the RTM January, I believe it's the 23rd or 22nd. And then there is a 10-day window after those funds are released. So we have to wait that full 10 days for at least a portion of the bids, and that puts us into early February. So that is the schedule that we laid out when we discussed this over the summer and early
Right. I
fall.
mean, we could conceivably sign contracts for up to $82 million, or round numbers, $82 million worth. Right. We couldn't sign all the contracts.
But we need to make the decision on if we're going to continue this path or not. So that, you know, obviously would want to be able to make that decision first, right?
I guess I just want to understand something from a sequencing standpoint based on what John said. We know what the charge is for our committee. Is it doable as a parliamentary matter or as a procedural matter to, in effect, get the input of the Board of Education as a next step, as an interim next step, before this board takes up the question of whether we want to proceed at the existing price point? For example, would the Board of Ed say, you know, gee, let us hear from Eric again, let us hear the high level options, and then we, the Board of Ed, will direct the building committee whether or not not direct, but we will give the building committee our input as to whether or not we think it makes sense to proceed with 1A or A1, A2, or B.
I mean, there's a lot of complexity here. Like the Board of Ed can say, okay, forget it. We want new buildings. And there's no guarantee that's going anywhere. I mean, maybe John or Jim will support that, but the RTM may or may not. So I think the Board of Ed doesn't officially meet again until January. It doesn't mean we couldn't try to call a special meeting. I am here as the Board of Ed representative. The Board of Ed created a master plan back in 2016. This is the next step. We voted on the ed specs. You know, that was sent forward to the building committee because this is what the Board of Ed believed was the right decision. I think while I appreciate the questions about the quality of the renovation that have been raised, I think that I'm not quite as concerned about that. I think the issue becomes with the greater cost. Is this still the path? I think, and there I have honestly, John, no confidence that town is willing to take on $200 million in debt service. I hear you and Jim talking. I understand the point, but I don't know that I necessarily feel that the Board of Education would be in a good position to say, great. I think there are timeline concerns. I think there's financial concerns, and so these decisions are made by multiple boards for a reason, I guess. And so I don't know that you could just throw it back to the Board of Ed as a simple matter.
No, sorry, my quick thing I was just going to say is back to your point, Chris, is that, and Dave Martin's point as well, is what we were tasked with was presenting a renovation as per the Board of Ed's decision a while back. We've done that. We've gotten to a place where we're kind of, I think, at the end line of making that decision. We present forward based on that request that this is the best option for what we were presented to do, and it goes in front of Board of Selectmen and up to them at that point, because it's the next step in the process for them to decide, well, we look forward and we think XYZ is better for the educational system of our town as the Board of Selectmen, and they make the decision. But to your points, both of your points, is like that. I don't know that the way I see it, it's not our choice to make that. Like, we're just here to say, yes, this is the best option of renovations moving forward, and we move forward from that.
Right. And they could say, we hear you, but we don't want to proceed at that number. And so we're going to talk to the Board of Ed about whether they want to rethink this thing from square one, in which case, not to be flipped, but kind of our job is done at that point. Right.
I mean, maybe to answer the sequencing question, why don't you do this? Chris and Jameson and others, David, have said that the charge of this committee is to act on those specs. You've got a plan that works for those specs. Why don't you vote to recommend that to the Board of Education and that they watch this video? And then Jill, you guys on the Board of Education can just raise the question. So we've got a recommendation based on our original specs. There have been reasonable concerns raised about whether we ought to take another look at that, given the costs and the potential for additional renovation between now and 25 years, well, post this renovation and 25 years from now, and just take another look at it. And you guys may decide after taking that look that, no, this is still what we want to do. Then that goes to the Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance, RTM for our regular process. In terms of sequencing, one choice would be for you guys to go ahead and recommend this. The Board of Education convenes when it can, either before the holidays or right after that. Both Jim and I are committed to convening our boards to do a review of this in advance of the RTM schedule. So I don't think we lose anything that way. We certainly can figure out a meeting in the first week in January as soon as the Board of Education reviews this. If you guys may decide that you just don't want to, and no, we don't need a meeting. We really want to stick with this. We've heard the discussion. That's it. And that's okay too. But what we can do is, I think, build in some time with the Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance to give the Board of Education some time to reconsider this if they want to. In the meantime, you've got a recommendation from your committee now if you in fact decide not to change your specs.
I would tweak that slightly, John. I would recommend that we go ahead and go to you guys on Monday and Tuesday, and the Board of Education could do something in parallel that queues us up correctly to be in front of the RTM in January, and I can figure out when to get to my board. But
yeah, I'd be okay with that, because what we could do is we can approve 1A, right?
Yeah.
And Jim can approve 1A on Tuesday. And that way, if you decide not to change anything, you've got that approved and in front of you. Right. But I mean, you guys tell me if you disagree, but I think the issues that we've discussed here in terms of taking a look at this and thinking about the costs and where these schools are and just the overall renovation philosophy versus new build over what needs to be 25 years for these buildings. Again, I just asked the question, I'm sure you've got it right.
But if you approve, if Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance approve Monday, Tuesday,
well, the next
that approval is what it is, or is it that approval then? Can you make that approval subject to Board of Ed?
Well, what we would do, I think, what I would do at that point is to say, if the Board of Education comes in after Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance approval, that you guys want to pursue a change, you can either pull it or recommend that the RTM turn it down, right? In which case they don't appropriate the money, we start the process over again. But doing what Jill suggests, we at least keep the sequencing and timing in place, such that if the Board of Education decides, no, we don't want to make any changes, no harm, no foul, the process is already in motion and nothing's delayed. But if you decide you do want to make a change, maybe we pull it right before the RTM.
And I think
that's the escape hatch.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that would enable also, I think, the Board of Ed to hear from the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance about their willingness to consider the possibility of other options.
Yeah, but ultimately, Jill's right, and others as well. The responsibility for this decision lies with the Board of Education and no place else. We have to take a look at it and approve it as a process matter, and we'll ask questions and make irritating points, as I have done fulsomely this evening. But ultimately, the Board of Education needs to do this. And I think having this process, if you're willing to go entertain this discussion at your board, and let's just see where it comes out. I'm sure any one of us would be happy to come to that meeting and try to assist in that discussion.
Jill, it's Patrick. If I could just chime in for a moment.
Please.
I actually applaud the idea of looking at a complete rebuild, but I think about the timing. And Jill, you've been very adamant about the experience of the students and the faculty starting now. So I think there would be a gap, right? They still have to endure what they're enduring now. At a time as such, the rebuild begins. So, and for the last school that gets done, that's an extended period of time. So we have to consider that as a group, and I just want to put that on the table tonight, based on everything I heard.
Plus, the middle school is slated for work in 2027.
Right.
You know, a building committee around that, or either a building committee or a large amount of work around that time. So that is another factor for the Board of Ed. There was a methodology behind the timeline planning of this. So things we'd have to talk about.
This is Laurel Purcell with O&G. Paula Bleakley is on the line as well. She's a principal over at Holmes, and she just wanted to point out about the portables. Let's not forget about the portables at the end of their lives, and to further delay these projects may have some impact on that. So just wanted to
think that's an example of what I'm talking about. Thanks, Laurel. Appreciate that.
Yeah, it's the portables. It's no HVAC. It's less technology. For conceivably for the third school until 2030. almost.
Right. So that last, think about the kids that are in kindergarten now. It's the whole time they're there. So I get it. The long term is always the better plan, but that is a short term need. So I don't want to overstate the point. I think it's clear. Thanks.
What's the estimated useful life of brand new Ox Ridge relative to 3 renovated elementary schools?
I'm
Is there
hoping
a
it's
material
500
difference?
So when we look at this from an architectural point of view, we say that a fully renovated building should be good for 25 to 30 years. A brand new school like Ox Ridge or Tokenique should be good for 35 to 40 years. So it's about a 10-year additional time frame before any significant renovations should be required. Now, there's going to be things along the way that you have to do to any of these buildings. You're going to have a 20-year warranty on your roof. So it's 20 years regardless of whether it's new or renovation. Sometimes you can extend that roof to 25 years, but that's basically our view is about a 10-year difference between renovation and new.
So and the reno was what number?
Reno's 25 to 30 years typically is what we look at.
Right. So that's your general number. So given the scope of the 3 schools that we're working on, could you comfortably apply that number to these actual projects?
But that would be if the 3 schools were fully renovated as new though, Eric, right? Because there's portions of those buildings in place now that are not, like the windows and things like that. We're not putting new windows in now. So they're right.
You're not replacing the bathroom. So at some point here, you may want to replace the bathroom. So that's correct. That when you're looking at it, it should be every space that's renovated should have an additional 25 to 30 year life.
That's a much better distinction and clarification. Thanks.
So it's a rolling 25 years, if you will.
Exactly.
Right?
Jill?
Yes.
Jill, I had a question going back to the portables. What is their life expectancy right now?
Kevin, would you answer that, please?
Kevin.
Happy to. They are well beyond their useful life expectancy. We've put significant funds and renovations into keeping them alive as long as they have been. And just touching on the roof point, our roofs are leaking. Some of them were supposed to be done 2 years ago, which didn't happen to be rolled into this larger project. So the roof concerns are significant.
Okay, and then I have one other question. Holmes is 85 years old, so I just want to make sure that with this new project, based on how old it is right now, you're still thinking that it's another 25 years, even though it'll be very old then.
So Monica,
No.
there's different building ages when you're looking at architecture over the course of the last century. The buildings that were designed and built in the 1950s and early 60s, like your previous Ox Ridge, failed. They had no insulation in them, and so at that point, Ox Ridge was a replacement project basically because of the time that it was built, it wasn't built as a quality building that we would expect to see today. When you're looking at Holmes was built in an age where things were built to be generally indestructible, and so you can renovate that building over and over again and still have plenty of useful life left in it. Because of the construction type and the way that it was built.
Okay.
To Henley and Royal as well, please, Eric. You were the one who it's your firm who coordinated the master plan and the initial building condition survey. Can you walk us through just the high points, please?
So both of those buildings are very serviceable. The project that's in place right now, if we were to proceed forward with it, would put those buildings in good condition for for the next generation. At that point, you'd have to reevaluate. Now, one thing that those buildings didn't have that we expect today and what we're addressing as part of this project is those classrooms were undersized. Royal and Henley have several classrooms that are about 600 square feet, where a state standard would say that you should have 800 square feet for a typical classroom for the classroom sizes that we have. So they're about 75% of the size that they should be. We're talking about resource rooms that we don't have today that are part of this project to add resource rooms so that we can accommodate those special programs that we want to provide to all of our students. So we're doing a lot to these buildings to bring them up, and that's some of the costs and some of the reasons why the project is what it is because you're taking maybe 3 classrooms and you're making 2 classrooms out of 3 classrooms, or you're shifting walls around to accommodate the size classrooms that you need. And part of that goes back to you, John, saying, if you're building new, you're building exactly what you want, right? You're building to the exact specifications you need. We are adopting these buildings to the modern ed specs that we've put forward, that we were charged to design to, and we're able to meet them in these buildings, and these buildings will be good for 25 more years.
Can I just ask for clarification? Option 1A, as I understand it, if we go with option 1A, we're about 70% either new or renovated. Is that correct? Is that the right way to say it?
That's correct.
Okay.
So there's 30% of the building, and it's some of the classrooms, some of the office spaces, some of the toilet rooms, as well as stairwells, and elevators, and some of the back of house spaces that aren't being renovated to that same level as part of this project.
Sarah, you had.
So, I really went into this past week thinking, boy, I really think we should just move forward with 1A. I know that we need to have these conversations and make sure we're on the same page. I also understand the gravity of doing these. This is very large numbers, but also this is the potential future of 3 of our elementary schools, which are the jewels in our town. And I know that this is important. I do see the benefit of continuing with the process and also having the Board of Ed just to have that final gut check, just to make sure. So I see the value in moving forward, but I also see the value in the Board of Ed just saying,
it would be pretty. Sorry,
I know it'll be hard timing wise. No, yeah.
Well, timing's not the only issue. I think the point that Kevin raises is an important one, and that in order to compare apples to apples, if we talk about an all new, you have to actually add the cost to keep those buildings alive for the period of time that they would need to be kept alive. So, Eric and Kevin, I guess if tomorrow we could talk about, we can still back of the envelope, but what that cost would be. We're going to have to do some roof replacements on some of the buildings in order for them to be alive through what is probably a 7-year window, because we're not going to turn around a new school in 2 years. We wouldn't file with the state until June 30th, and we are already late for designing for this year. We can't, this year is already gone. So we would really be talking about starting, kind of next. I mean, we could start work, but in terms of filing and meeting you'd be bidding next January at the earliest.
Jill, just as a, sorry, go ahead, John.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, just as a quick reference point, back in November of last year, when we added the roofs to this project, the sum of the expected cost at that time for all the roofs was $4 million for the roofs at the 3 elementary schools.
Okay, so
just a data point, right? I mean, depending on how much you want to torture it with escalation and all those.
Well, but that was replacing the roofs, right? I don't know that you necessarily would replace the roofs. You would be doing a lot of repairs and keeping the school, to use Jill's term, keeping the schools alive until you were ready to start building the new ones and then demo the old ones. I don't know that you would do a full replacement of roofs. Kevin, you know better than I do about the condition, but
Right, and I think that speaks to John's point earlier. It would almost be a run to failure model. But I just wanted to point out we have not budgeted any capital projects for these three schools for the past 2 years, knowing full well that this was more than likely going to take place. So we have a plethora of concerns that if we change course would need to be addressed, at least just to keep band-aiding and keeping the building serviceable.
And I think the next, I mean, I appreciate all these comments. My recommendation would be to bring this discussion to a close. I think there's enough perspective here for the Board of Education to decide whether it wants to pick this up or not. And that all of us or some subgroup can go to that Board of Education meeting should they decide to convene a discussion to support them in some way if they want to reconsider this. But it seems like we have a plan, which is you guys vote to recommend, based on the specs that you were given, this 1A project to the Board of Ed. The Board of Selectmen will take this up on Monday. Jim will take it up with the Board of Finance on Tuesday. We'll go through those approvals, ask questions, all of that. In the meantime, the Board of Education can decide what it wants to do, and we can support them in a reconsideration of this, reconvene Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance in early January if they want to go a different route, or take more time to do this, but let the Board of Education take it from here. If you guys decide that 1A is fine, then the process remains on track. So why don't we close off this discussion unless there's something more and let the Board of Education pick it up from here.
Any further comments from committee members or others?
No.
Then
I think it would be helpful for the Board of Education probably to know from the committee what they recommend beyond just the process. For the committee members who have seen this process, if all of us are just voting to pass it forward, but none of us actually think it's the right idea, I just think it would be helpful for the Board of Ed to hear kind of where people are in space.
Well, I think you're asking them there's two ways they could comment. One is on the charge that you gave them, which is, to David Martin's point, against the specs that you prescribed. Or if you want to hear from them, whether they want to go beyond that, then you're really trying to get them to comment on revising the specs. I don't know if that's their charge, but I mean,
I'm just wanting to make sure that I know if anybody's voting yes, but wouldn't vote yes.
But we're only voting yes on the specs. Like, we're not voting yes on a different project.
You're voting yes on whether
Correct.
the project you've come up, whether the plan you've come up with meets the specs you were given. That's what you're voting on.
Well, no, I think it's additionally whether this committee is comfortable recommending moving forward at the price point that we're at.
Fair point.
We've known for a while that the project meets the specs. That's a design question. The question before us is, are we comfortable sending it to the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance at this price point, knowing now, as a result of this meeting, that the likely next step after that is further consideration by the Board of Education. And to Jill's point, it sounds like, and I don't know if this is possible again as a procedural matter, almost like polling the committee as to, how do you feel about the project in your gut, right? I mean, is that,
Yeah.
I'll start. I'm never a fan of just making a decision based on momentum or inertia, but relying on our professionals, Eric and his team, and ONGAP. My view is we move ahead with the project at the price point. It's expensive, but we get the kids in newly renovated schools and out of portables with new technology and new systems in 2025, 2026 on all three schools. So I would be in favor of moving forward with it.
Thank you.
I mimic what you said. That's like we've done a lot of work on this. We need to get the kids in schools that are renovated. That's what we were tasked with. We present that forward, and that this is the best price that we're going to get after all the work we've done, the due diligence we've done. This is the best product and price that we can provide.
I agree with you both. I concur fully.
I also agree.
Okay.
David and Sarah.
Agreed.
Yeah, agreed.
Thank you. I am as well, but
I mean, Jill, if you wanted me to weigh in on the color concept, my big concerns with doing anything different would be Kevin has already highlighted they would have to go back to the drawing board and identify all of the effectively deferred capital projects that have been done, and I don't know what those are beyond, at a bare minimum, repairing the roof enough so that the schools could be run to death, if you will, to use that analogy. And secondly, we know that the middle school is coming up in 2027, I think you said, right? So doing something else involving any other new build, trying to factor in a material renovation potentially at the middle school on top of that gets to be a very complicated and probably expensive thing. So I'm just not sure. I'm not sure how your board would feel about being able to manage all that.
Thank you. Kevin, do you
go ahead, Kevin? I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Jill. I'm sorry.
Kevin or the principals, does any of you want to add anything?
No, I think it's all been stated very clearly. I appreciate everybody's effort and time.
Okay, Chris.
I mean, I guess with that, would like to make a motion to proceed on the existing design and to request an increase in the total appropriation by the amount of 18,990,735 allocated across each of the three schools, so that when we do make the request, we will make it as three separate appropriation requests as we have in the past, and that we take that request to the Board of Selectmen on Monday, December the 18th, and the Board of Finance on Tuesday, December the 19th. That's a long-winded motion, but can I have a motion to do that?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Unanimous among the quorum.
Thank you to everybody. This has been a productive discussion.
So we'll see you Monday, and we're available to talk between now and then, because this is more fun than I could have ever hoped for.
Or as they used to say back in Texas, we're having so much fun, I'd have to hire somebody to help me enjoy it all.
First, we still need to vote to adjourn the meeting.
Yes, I understand. Can I get a
Sorry.
motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All right.
In favor? Seconded. In favor. Again, a big thank you to the design and construction teams, and Dave Martin, for pulling all of this together on an expedited basis. So
Yeah, thank you.
Really
Hey, Chris?
appreciate it. Yes.
Hey, Chris, I just want to say a big thank you to all of you. This is a monumental task. You guys have spent, I don't even know, countless hours on it, looking at it. I know that you're examining everything really carefully, and the town really appreciates it.
Yep.
Well, thank you for saying that. All right.
Okay.
Thanks,
I'm
everyone.
sure we'll all be talking again soon. Thank you, everybody.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye.